In the riverine community of Autumnmere, mornings began before the sun fully committed to the sky. Canoes slid into the water with low wooden scrapes, paddles cutting through mist that hovered just above the river's surface. The air smelled of wet earth, fish scales, and smoke from cooking fires that had been lit in near darkness. Roosters crowed late, as if even they respected the rhythm of the river. At the center of the village, beyond rows of mud brick houses roofed with corrugated zinc, stood the shrine compound, fenced with carved wooden posts darkened by decades of oil and rain. It was not grand in the way city buildings were grand, but it carried weight. People lowered their voices when passing it. Children did not play near it. Even the fishermen, who feared very little, removed their caps when they walked along the narrow footpath beside its outer wall. Inside that compound, secured behind a heavy door reinforced with bronze studs, was the object that defined Autumnmere's identity, the ancient golden key. The elders said it had been recovered generations ago after a flood nearly swallowed the land. Others said it had been forged by the first custodian under divine instruction. No one agreed fully on its origin, but everyone agreed on its importance. The key was not displayed for admiration. It was not used to open anything visible. It symbolized stewardship over the land and river, and the belief that as long as it remained under rightful care, Autumnmere would be spared disaster. That responsibility rested on one man, Chief Adewale, the chief custodian. Ethan, his 16-year-old son, understood from an early age that their household did not belong entirely to them. It belonged in part to history. Chief Adewale was not loud, nor did he carry himself with theatrical authority. He was measured in speech and deliberate in movement, a man who listened longer than he spoke. His hair had begun to gray at the temples, and his palms were permanently rough from years of ritual cleansing and farming alike. Unlike some leaders who separated themselves from ordinary labor, Adewale still joined fishermen at dawn when time allowed, still attended naming ceremonies, still settled disputes beneath the udala tree with patience rather than intimidation. The golden key did not sit in his house. It remained in the inner chamber of the shrine, placed inside a carved wooden chest lined with red cloth. Only he and 2 designated shrine priests were permitted to handle it during ritual observances, and even then it was done in silence. On the first market day of every month, a small procession formed before sunrise. Drums were beaten softly, not celebratory but steady, disciplined. Women in plain wrappers swept the shrine courtyard. Adewale would bathe in water drawn from a specific bend in the river, change into white cloth, and walk barefoot into the inner chamber while the priests waited outside. Ethan had begun accompanying him the year he turned 14, not as a participant but as an observer. He stood near the doorway, watching his father unwrap the cloth carefully, lift the key with both hands, and inspect it under lamplight for any sign of corrosion or damage. The key was larger than Ethan had imagined when he first saw it, its shaft thick, its bow engraved with symbols worn smooth by time. It did not glitter flamboyantly. Its gold was muted, dignified, as if age had taught it restraint. After inspection, Adewale would whisper the same line each time, low enough that only Ethan could hear. Power is heavy. It must be carried, not displayed. It was not a proverb recited for effect. It was instruction. Ethan took those words seriously. He did not boast at school about his father's role, even when other boys tried to draw him into arguments about whose family mattered more. He preferred sitting by the riverbank in the evenings, mending nets beside his father, while absorbing lessons that sounded ordinary but were layered with meaning. Adewale taught him how to read currents, how to sense approaching storms by the shift in wind temperature, how to speak to elders without submission, yet without arrogance. Sometimes, during shrine preparation days, he would allow Ethan to wipe the outer chest with a clean cloth, or to hold the lantern while he secured the lock. These gestures were subtle acknowledgments of succession without formal announcement. The elders had not declared Ethan heir, but it was understood. Not everyone accepted that understanding comfortably. Chief Adewale's authority had been stable for years, yet influence in Autumnmere was never static. There were senior council members who had once hoped the custodianship might rotate within extended family lines. Elder Bassi, whose farmland bordered the shrine path, often lingered longer than necessary during meetings, his gaze resting on the locked chamber door with an expression that was difficult to read. Another council member, Elder Timi, had grown increasingly vocal about the need to modernize certain traditions, suggesting that sacred artifacts should be documented, perhaps even studied by outside historians for recognition and potential funding. Adewale listened to these proposals without visible irritation, but he did not concede. "Some things survive because they are protected from attention," he would reply calmly. The discussions ended there, yet the undercurrent remained. Ethan noticed the exchanged glances during council gatherings, the pauses that lasted a second too long. His father noticed them too. One evening, as they secured the shrine after a minor cleansing ritual, Adewale rested his hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder and said, "Respect everyone. Trust carefully." It was the closest he had come to acknowledging tension openly. The night the storm came, it did not arrive gently. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened to a flat gray that pressed low over the river. Fishermen returned earlier than usual, tying their canoes tighter than necessary. The air felt unsettled, thick with the metallic scent that precedes heavy rain. Adewale insisted on checking the shrine before nightfall, as he always did when weather threatened. Ethan followed with a lantern, the wind already tugging at the flame. Inside the compound, the drums that usually marked ritual days were silent. Only the rustle of palm fronds against the fence broke the quiet. Adewale examined the outer locks first, then stepped into the inner chamber. Ethan waited at the threshold, aware of the steady thud of his own heartbeat as thunder rolled overhead. Rain began abruptly, striking the zinc rooftops with force, drowning out smaller sounds. After several minutes, Adewale reemerged, expression unreadable, and secured the door firmly. They walked home through sheets of rain, heads lowered, the path turning to slick mud beneath their feet. Sometime deep into the night, when most of Autumnmere was awake only in fragments between thunderclaps, a sharp crack echoed from the direction of the shrine compound. Wood against metal, followed by the hollow bang of something swinging loose. At first it blended with the storm's violence. By dawn, when villagers gathered cautiously to assess damage, they found the outer gate partially ajar, one hinge twisted. The inner chamber door had swung open, its lock shattered against the floor. The wooden chest lay tilted on its side, red cloth spilled outward like a wound. Adewale stood motionless just inside the doorway, rainwater dripping from the hem of his wrapper. Ethan stepped beside him and looked into the chest himself, as if refusing to rely on assumption. The space where the golden key had rested was empty. No broken fragments, no scattered debris, just absence. Outside, the storm began to recede, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the rain. No one spoke immediately. The river flowed on, indifferent. The key was gone. By mid-morning, the entire council of elders had assembled beneath the wide Iroko tree at the center of Autumnmere. Word had spread quickly after the shrine was found open, and the usual rhythm of the village paused in uneasy anticipation. Fishermen left their nets half-mended. Women abandoned market stalls to stand at a distance, whispering into folded palms. No one approached the inner shrine compound without permission, but the broken lock and the empty chest were no longer secrets. Chief Adewale stood at the front of the gathering, not elevated, not seated, simply present. His wrapper was clean, his shoulders squared, yet his eyes were strained from a night without sleep. Ethan stood slightly behind him, close enough to hear every breath his father took. The first questions came gently, almost cautiously. Elder Bassi cleared his throat and asked whether the key had been moved for any special ritual. Another elder inquired whether the priests had handled it recently without proper documentation. The tone was restrained, as if the council hoped the matter could be resolved through a simple explanation. Adewale answered each question directly. No, the key had not been relocated. No, no special rites had been scheduled. Yes, the chest had been locked personally by him before the storm intensified. He did not raise his voice. He did not deflect. He spoke with the steadiness of a man who believed facts would protect him. For a brief moment, there was silence, and it seemed possible that the elders might direct their concern outward, to the broken hinge, to the violent weather, to the unknown hand that must have forced entry. But silence, when prolonged, can shift direction. The shift came slowly. Elder Timi stepped forward, adjusting the hem of his robe before speaking. He did not accuse outright. Instead, he began with concern. "These are modern times," he said, addressing the circle rather than Adewale directly. "Sacred objects are no longer safe simply because we call them sacred. There are collectors. There are buyers who pay well for artifacts with history." A murmur moved through the crowd. The suggestion hung in the air before anyone fully processed it. Another elder added, "We have heard of communities losing their relics to foreigners who offer quiet incentives." The word incentives settled heavily. Adewale's jaw tightened, though he did not interrupt. He waited until the murmurs softened and responded with visible restraint. "If you are suggesting that I would exchange the protection of this land for money, say it plainly," he said. "Do not hide it in stories about outsiders." The directness unsettled some of the elders, but it also emboldened others. Bassi shifted his stance and finally met Adewale's gaze. "No one wishes to accuse without reason," he replied, "but you are the only one entrusted with direct access. The storm may have broken wood, but it did not choose the chest. It did not select the key." The implication no longer required translation. Whispers rippled outward from the council circle into the gathered villagers. Words like collector, secret sale, and debt began to circulate in low tones. Ethan felt heat rise behind his ears as he heard his father's name attached to phrases he had only ever associated with distant scandals. He wanted to step forward, to interrupt, to remind them of every dawn ritual, every careful inspection, every warning his father had given about stewardship, but he remained where he stood, fingers curled into fists at his sides. As the discussion hardened, so did the faces around them. Adewale raised both hands, not in surrender but in appeal. "Search my house," he said clearly. "Search my land. Question the priests again. Bring anyone who claims knowledge forward. I have nothing to hide." His voice broke slightly on the last sentence, not from guilt, but from the strain of being unheard. Yet once suspicion is planted publicly, it grows beyond evidence. Elder Timi pressed further, suggesting that if an exchange had occurred, it would have been discreet, arranged beyond the village's awareness. He spoke of unseen boats, of transactions conducted at night along isolated bends of the river. The narrative built itself piece by piece, drawing on fear rather than proof. The villagers listening began to reconsider past events through this new lens. A new fishing canoe Adewale had purchased months earlier became, in whispered retelling, potential evidence of unexplained income. The repairs to his roof were cited as suspicious timing. Every ordinary action was reinterpreted. Adewale shook his head slowly, as if attempting to dispel smoke with reason. "You all know my life," he said. "You have eaten in my home. You have sent your sons to train with me. If I had desired wealth, I would not have remained here guarding a key that opens nothing visible." The honesty in his tone was unmistakable, yet the momentum had already shifted. Bassi signaled to the shrine attendants who stepped forward with solemn faces. What began as inquiry had turned into judgment. Ethan felt the ground tilt beneath him, not physically but morally, as if the foundation of belonging was being removed piece by piece. The formal declaration was delivered without shouting, which made it more devastating. Elder Timi announced that until the key was recovered and the truth established, Chief Adewale would be relieved of his custodial duties. The language was procedural, but the act was public. Two attendants approached his father. One reached for the strand of ceremonial beads, resting against Adewale's chest, beads worn only by the chief custodian during official functions. Ethan had seen his father polish them carefully, understanding their symbolic weight. Now, without ceremony, they were lifted from his neck. Adewale did not resist. He closed his eyes briefly as the cool air touched the skin the beads had covered for years. The final act was the drum, A smaller ceremonial drum, used rarely and only for matters of grave consequence, was brought forward. Its sound was not loud, but it was unmistakable, a slow, deliberate rhythm beaten to mark disgrace. Each strike echoed across the square, settling into the chests of those who listened. Women lowered their eyes. Some men shifted uncomfortably. Others watched with rigid satisfaction. Ethan stood frozen, unable to reconcile the image before him with the father who had taught him discipline and restraint. He saw not just the removal of title, but the dismantling of dignity. Adewale opened his eyes after the final drumbeat and looked directly at his son. There was no anger in his expression, only a profound exhaustion. "We will endure this," he said quietly, though it was unclear whether he meant it as reassurance or resolve. Around them, the council began to disperse, conversation resuming in fragmented whispers that no longer needed to hide their accusations. The title had been stripped, the beads removed, and as the drum's echo faded into the ordinary sounds of the village, Ethan understood that something more than an object had been lost. In the days that followed the public stripping of his title, Adewale discovered that disgrace in Audemir did not arrive as noise, but as subtraction. No one threw stones at his house. No one spat when he passed. The punishment was quieter and more exacting than that. Men who had once risen slightly when he approached remained seated. Conversations narrowed as he drew near, then resumed only after he had moved beyond hearing. At the riverbank, fishermen shifted their canoes a few feet away when he began to untangle his nets, not enough to be accused of hostility, but enough to create a visible gap. The shrine compound, which had structured his days for years, stood within sight of his path, yet beyond his reach. He did not attempt to enter. So he adjusted. He rose at the same hour, bathed at the same bend of the river, and tended his small farm in silence. Ethan felt the shift more acutely because it was delivered without courtesy. One afternoon near the marketplace, as he stood bargaining for dried fish, a voice behind him said, "Make way for the son of a thief." The words were not shouted. They were spoken in the same tone one might use to request passage. Laughter followed, thin and uncertain, but sufficient. The council reconvened 3 days after the disgrace ceremony. This time the gathering was smaller, more procedural than accusatory. Elder Bassi stood slightly apart from the circle at first, hands clasped behind his back, his posture suggesting reluctance rather than ambition. Elder Timi opened the discussion by speaking of continuity. "The shrine cannot remain unattended," he said. "Ritual observances cannot pause while we debate." There was agreement in that. The key was missing, but the structure surrounding it remained. The fear among the elders was not merely about theft, it was about instability. Bassi waited until the initial comments subsided before offering his position. He did not criticize Adewale directly. Instead, he spoke of duty. "Until the key is recovered," he said evenly, "the village requires interim oversight. Not authority for its own sake, but stewardship to reassure our people." He emphasized the word interim. His tone carried humility, as though he were volunteering for burden rather than advantage. Several elders nodded. One remarked that Bassi's farmland bordered the shrine path and that his proximity made him a practical choice. Another observed that stability required visible leadership. No one suggested a vote. Consensus formed through repetition. Finally, Timi turned to Bassi and asked whether he would accept temporary custodianship until the matter was resolved. Bassi lowered his head briefly before answering, "If it protects Audemir, I will serve," he said. The phrasing was deliberate. It implied sacrifice. By late afternoon, it was announced publicly that Elder Bassi would act as interim custodian until the golden key was recovered and rightful stewardship clarified. The announcement did not conclude the matter. It introduced a deadline. 2 days after assuming the role, Bassi requested that Adewale appear before the council again. The gathering was less crowded than the first, but no less charged. Ethan stood beside his father, shoulders squared, prepared for renewed accusation. Bassi spoke first. His voice carried the calm of procedure. "The disappearance of the key is not a small offense," he began. "Whether through negligence or intention, it has endangered the spiritual and communal order of this land." He paused, allowing the weight of the statement to settle. "Therefore, in accordance with our laws governing sacred custodianship, the former custodian is granted 14 working days to produce the key or credible evidence of its recovery. If at the end of that period the key remains missing, the council will interpret that absence as confirmation of betrayal. The penalty will be execution." There was no raised voice, no dramatics. The words were delivered as though they described weather. Ethan felt the air constrict around him. Adewale did not protest. He held Bassie's gaze steadily and inclined his head once, acknowledging receipt of the decree. 14 days, he repeated quietly. "I understand." It was not submission. It was acceptance of process. Outside the circle, villagers whispered of fairness. Some argued that the deadline was generous. Others wondered privately how a man could retrieve what he insisted he had not taken. The decision stood. The drum that had marked his disgrace now marked the countdown. From that day forward, Bassie's movements intensified. It seemed Bassie was also secretly deeply in search of the key, but the reason for this was not clear. Search parties were organized to examine the riverbanks more thoroughly, particularly near the bend where storm currents had been strongest. Canoes were dispatched upriver at dawn and returned near dusk, their occupants reporting little beyond disturbed sediment and debris lodged against tree roots. Bassie attended each report personally. He ordered additional dives in locations that others considered exhausted. Privately, he reviewed the accounts again and again, pressing divers for details others might overlook. Sleep shortened. Meals were taken absent-mindedly. Those closest to him noticed tension around his eyes, but attributed it to the strain of leadership. In the village square, his authority began to solidify through repetition. Rituals continued under his supervision. The shrine compound was inspected daily. Locks were reinforced. Villagers who had once deferred to Adewale now brought minor disputes to Bassie without hesitation. For Adewale and Ethan, the 14 days assumed the shape of inevitability. They did not mount a campaign for sympathy. Adewale did not visit households to plead his innocence. He worked his fields in the morning and repaired old tools in the afternoon. At night, he began to put his affairs in order with deliberate calm. He called Ethan to sit beside him and reviewed the boundaries of their land, reciting markers from memory. The tamarind tree at the edge of the marsh, the broken canoe half buried near the western bank. He drafted a will with assistance from a distant cousin who arrived reluctantly and left quickly, unwilling to be seen lingering too long. The document transferred the farm and house to Ethan outright, with instructions regarding harvest rotation and debt settlement. Adewale sold 2 goats quietly and distributed small sums to cover outstanding obligations so that no creditor could harass his son after his death. He selected which garments he would wear on the appointed day and washed them himself. There was no dramatization in these acts. He prepared as a man who believed the system, once set in motion, would complete its course. What cut more deeply than the decree was the absence of farewell. No elder came privately to say goodbye. No former ally visited at dusk. Even those who suspected his innocence feared association more than injustice. On the 12th day, Ethan waited outside longer than necessary at the river, half expecting someone to approach with information, a rumor, a reconsideration. None came. The village had adjusted to the countdown as though it were an approaching festival rather than an execution. As the final days narrowed, tension settled over Odemere with the steadiness of heat before rain. The 14th morning did not arrive with spectacle. It came the way all mornings in Odemere came, humid, pale, and indifferent. Ethan woke before his father, though neither of them had truly slept. The drum that marked the final sunset the night before had been slower than the others, as though even the drummer had grown tired of repetition. There had been no visitors afterward, no elder seeking private reconciliation, no childhood friend knocking hesitantly at their door. Adewale had folded his washed garments carefully and placed them at the foot of his sleeping mat. His will lay rolled and tied with twine on the low wooden table near the wall. When Ethan rose, he found his father already seated outside, staring toward the river through the thin veil of morning mist. There was no tremor in his posture, only stillness. Execution in Odomir did not occur in secrecy. It was deliberate and public, meant to restore order through visibility. The condemned would be escorted to the clearing beyond the shrine compound shortly before noon, where the council would pronounce final judgment and carry out the sentence. The method, ritual hanging from the Iroko limb reserved for such matters, had not changed in decades. It was not theatrical, it was procedural. By custom, the condemned could take a final meal before being led away. In that morning, Ethan had gone to fish, to prepare his father his favorite meal and last meal. He took his net and walked toward the river without looking at anyone he passed. The fishermen along the bank shifted subtly, creating space without acknowledgement. He cast his net with mechanical precision. The first throw yielded nothing of value, the second snagged against submerged debris. He adjusted, braced himself, and pulled steadily until a large riverfish surfaced through the disturbed water, heavy and thick-bodied from feeding after the storm. He struck it cleanly against the side of the canoe to still it and placed it in his basket. It would suffice. When he returned home, Ethan realized his father has already been taken away. The compound felt altered by absence. The stool where his father had sat remained slightly angled toward the river. Ethan did not correct it. He set the fish on the low wooden table and sharpened his knife with deliberate care. He would cook, then carry the meal to the clearing before noon. Executions in Odomir followed order. There were pronouncements, confirmations, final statements. Time remained. He slit the fish along the belly and began clearing its contents methodically. His hands did not tremble. They moved with the efficiency of habit. Halfway through the incision, the blade struck something hard. He paused, assuming it to be a stone or fragment drawn from the riverbed during feeding. He widened the cut slightly and reached inside. His fingers closed around metal, cold, solid, unyielding. He withdrew his hand slowly. For a second, his mind rejected recognition. The object lay in his palm, smeared with bile and river residue, its weight unmistakable. The engraved bow emerged beneath the slime as he wiped it instinctively against his wrapper. The symbols were familiar. He had watched his father inspect them under lamplight for years. The golden key rested in his hand with the quiet authority of something that had never belonged to accusation. Ethan stared at it as if expecting it to disappear. The fish lay open on the table beside him, mute evidence of chance. He inhaled sharply, then exhaled once, controlled. There was no time to stand, stunned. He rinsed the key quickly in a basin of water. The metal did not shine. It remained dulled by what it had endured, but it was intact. He wrapped it in the cleanest cloth he could find and ran. The clearing beyond the shrine compound was already crowded. The Iroko branch designated for execution cast a narrow shadow over the assembled council. Adewale stood beneath it, unbound, hands resting at his sides. The rope hung coiled nearby, not yet fastened. Elder Timi was speaking, reciting formal language about custodial betrayal and communal restoration. Bassi stood slightly forward of the others, expression composed, gaze steady on the proceedings. The ritual hangman waited for the concluding signal. Ethan did not slow as he approached. He pushed through the outer ring of villagers, ignoring the startled protests at his sudden intrusion. When he broke into the open center of the clearing, he did not shout at first. His breath tore at his lungs from the sprint. He dropped to one knee from momentum more than intention and unwrapped the cloth with shaking hands. "Stop," he managed finally, the word carrying across the clearing just as Timmy concluded his statement. The hangman hesitated instinctively. The council turned. Ethan lifted the object high enough that the elders could see clearly. For a moment, silence absorbed everything, the murmurs, the wind through leaves, the distant river. Recognition moved slowly but decisively across faces. One of the shrine priests stepped forward first, disbelief etched plainly. He took the key from Ethan's hand and examined the engravings along its shaft, tracing the worn symbols with his thumb. "It is the original," he said, voice stripped of ceremony. A visible ripple moved through the crowd. The rope remained slack. Adewale did not move immediately. He watched the exchange with controlled disbelief, as though afraid the scene might fracture if he stepped out of place. Bassi approached with measured steps and requested the key from the priest. He examined it carefully, turning it once in his hand, inspecting the engravings, the shaft, the familiar weight. His face revealed nothing beyond concentration. When he finally spoke, his tone was level. "Where was this found?" "In a fish," Ethan answered, rising now to his feet. "Caught this morning, at the river bend." A murmur of astonishment replaced the earlier tension. Storm currents, dislodged chest, swallowed metal. The explanation formed collectively without guidance. Several villagers exchanged glances heavy with reconsideration. The accusation that had seemed airtight 14 days earlier now appeared hurried. Adewale stepped forward only when the rope was lowered completely. He did not touch it. He did not address the crowd. He waited. Bassi turned toward the council, maintaining composure. "The recovery of the key alters the circumstances," he said. "The sentence cannot proceed under uncertainty." The phrasing preserved authority while acknowledging interruption. Timi cleared his throat, visibly unsettled. The ritual hangman stepped back fully, coil of rope gathered in his arms, uncertain whether to retreat or await instruction. The drum that had marked countdown remained silent. The clearing did not erupt into celebration. It recalibrated. Villagers who had watched with rigid certainty now avoided direct eye contact with either Adewale or Ethan. Shame did not announce itself loudly in Autumnmere. It manifested in lowered gazes and careful repositioning. The shrine priest held the key close, as though reacquainting himself with its physical presence. Adewale finally stepped away from the Iroko's shadow and stood beside his son. He did not embrace him. He placed a steady hand against Ethan's shoulder once, firm and brief. It was acknowledgement, not of victory, but of interruption. The explanation that formed most quickly, and most conveniently, was accidental loss. A violent storm, a damaged hinge, a chest overturned, a current strong enough to dislodge metal and carry it downstream, a fish swallowing what glinted or shifted in murky water. The narrative required no villain, only misfortune. It allowed the council to correct course without admitting haste. The possibility that he had not sold the key gained ground rapidly. Suspicion began dissolving into collective relief that disaster had been narrowly avoided. It might have concluded there, an error attributed to nature, a man nearly executed for circumstance, had the clearing not been interrupted by a voice unfamiliar in accent and unrestrained by village protocol. The man who entered from the southern path did not lower his head before the elders. He moved with the confidence of someone who did not consider himself subject to the clearing's authority. He stopped several paces from the council circle and spoke without greeting. "Where is my payment returned?" he asked in accented but clear English. The clearing stiffened. His gaze settled directly on Adewale. "You promised delivery," he continued. "The object was not delivered. My advance was not returned." The words struck with calculated directness. Murmurs flared instantly. The fragile reconstruction of innocence fractured. Villagers who had just recalibrated toward relief felt the ground tilt again. The foreigner's accusation aligned precisely with the earlier suspicions: collector, incentive, discreet exchange. Several heads turned sharply toward the former custodian. The recovery of the key no longer erased motive. It complicated it. If the key had been found in a fish, perhaps it had been dropped during transfer. Perhaps the sale had failed. The narrative shifted with alarming speed. Adewale did not step back. He said nothing. Before further exchange could solidify blame anew, another commotion arose at the far edge of the gathering. A second outsider approached, this one darker-skinned, dressed in urban attire common to coastal traders, flanked by two men who bore themselves not as villagers, but as hired security. He did not hesitate at the boundary of the clearing, his voice carried without strain. "I am not here for debate," he announced. "I am here for settlement." His eyes did not search for Adewale. They fixed immediately on Bassi. You assured delivery within 10 days. 10 days became 14. Now the object resurfaces publicly. My funds were transferred in good faith. I want them returned in full." The effect was immediate and destabilizing. 2 foreigners, 2 claims. 2 separate accusations pointed in opposite directions. Bassi stepped forward with measured indignation. "This is absurd," he said, spreading his hands slightly. "These men arrive uninvited, each demanding money for a sacred object no one here would ever sell." His tone was firm, edged with wounded authority. "If one claims Adewale promised delivery and another claims I did, then at least one lies." The villagers seized that logic instinctively. Suspicion fractured rather than settled. It was improbable that 2 separate custodians would negotiate the same relic independently. He looked from one foreigner to the other with controlled disbelief. "You mistake our customs," he continued. "Sacred objects are not traded in Odemir." The first foreigner, the pale man, shifted uneasily, glancing toward the second as if recognizing competition. The second foreigner did not share that uncertainty. He reached into his leather satchel and withdrew documents, transfer confirmations, correspondence records bearing coded references but clear dates. He held them aloft for the council to see. "The agreement was not with the former custodian," he said, eyes still on Bassi. "It was with the acting authority who assured me he could secure the key discreetly." The clearing tightened around that phrasing, acting authority. Bassi's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Before he could respond, movement from within the villagers disrupted the fragile balance. A man stepped forward from the 3rd row of onlookers, lean, sun-darkened, eyes hollowed by nights without rest. It was the messenger who had arrived at Bassi's compound during the storm weeks earlier. Until that moment, he had kept his distance, silent, blending into routine. Now he did not look at Bassi. He looked at Adewale, then at the key in the priest's hand, then finally at the council. His voice trembled at first, then steadied. "I was sent," he said. No one spoke over him. "I was sent to enter the shrine during the storm. The hinge was loosened earlier. I was given the timing." A ripple passed through the elders like wind across tall grass. He swallowed once and continued. "I did not act alone. I acted on instruction." The clearing's focus narrowed. Bassi's composure fractured in increments. "Careful," he warned quietly, but the messenger did not stop. "I was promised payment when the key was delivered. I was told it would leave by canoe at the southern bend where the current runs narrow. The storm worsened. The canoe shifted. The key slipped. I dove. I searched until I could not breathe. It was gone." He exhaled shakily. "I returned that night to report failure. I was told to remain silent. I was told if the key was not recovered, I would answer for the loss with my life." His words did not rise theatrically. They accumulated, each detail tightening the circle around Bassi. For 14 days he has searched not to save Adewale, but to save himself. The foreigner's money was already taken. I have seen it. The second foreigner lifted his chin slightly at that confirmation. The first foreigner, now visibly unsettled, stepped back a pace as though recognizing misdirection in his own involvement. Bassi attempted interruption, accusing the messenger of fabrication born from fear. Murmurs thickened into audible disapproval. The second foreigner extended his documents to the council formally now. "Payment was routed through intermediaries connected to this man," he said, gesturing to Bassi. "I do not care for your internal politics. I care for my funds." The accumulation became irreversible. 2 external demands, 1 internal witness. Bassi's denials thinned with each layer. His eyes moved rapidly across the faces that had supported him days earlier and now withheld certainty. He understood, visibly, that the logic shielding him had collapsed. When he finally spoke, it was without indignation. He did not deny instructing the messenger. He did not dispute the advance received. The admission was not loud, but it was complete. The clearing did not erupt. It absorbed. Elder Timi, who had once pronounced execution, now addressed the assembly with restrained gravity. "The former custodian stands vindicated," he said formally. The accusation of sale is withdrawn. The interim custodian stands in confessed violation of sacred trust and endangerment of life. Adewale did not move immediately. He stood beside Ethan, who remained steady despite the ordeal. When the priest extended the golden key back toward him, Adewale accepted it with both hands, inspecting it briefly as he had done countless mornings before. No speech accompanied the gesture. The restoration of authority required no spectacle. The council declared Bassi removed from all office effective immediately and sentenced to 2 years of confinement within the village's holding compound, followed by social ostracism. No participation in council, no ritual role, no communal deliberation. Upon release, the second foreigner was assured restitution would be pursued from Bassi's seized assets. The first, having failed to substantiate a direct agreement, retreated without further demand. As the clearing dispersed slowly, villagers avoided dramatics. Shame circulated quietly. Adewale placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder once more, not as reassurance this time, but as recognition that inheritance had been tested publicly and survived. The rope was removed from the Iroko branch without ceremony. The drum that had counted down 14 days did not beat again. Order did not return through celebration. It returned through acknowledgement of fact, through admission of compromise, through the visible reinstatement of a man nearly destroyed by suspicion. And as the crowd thinned, Ademir stood not purified, but corrected, aware now that power, when pursued without restraint, corrodes faster than metal lost to a storm.